So I want to talk about the tension between being an advocate or an activist and an academic. And this has happened to me in the area of bioethics in two different ways. I came into talking about prenatal diagnosis and genetics from having a commitment to disabled people and from worrying that prenatal diagnosis and screening and selective termination were an assault on the viability of disabled people and their right to exist. And I think I felt it very personally as well. So I came into it really as an activist and started writing papers in the 1990s and in 95 and 98. In 1996, I made a television program called Ivy's Genes, very much putting this view, making comparisons between genetics and Nazi eugenics. But as part of making that program, the producers said, we want another voice. And they said, we want you to meet a geneticist. And I met somebody in 96 called John Byrne, who was the head of Northern Genetics Service. Very nice, still a friend. And he, highly intelligent, very understanding of where I was coming from, started talking to me about the experience of his patients. Challenged me to think of the experience of women having terminations on the grounds of disability. And that really made me think. It made me stop. And it challenged my activist, strident opposition. Another thing that happened on a personal level was that one of my colleagues pointed out that a mutual friend of ours, an older woman, who'd wanted to have children all her life, had, at the age of 40, been pregnant, happy about that, and then been diagnosed with a fetus affected by Down syndrome, and had very reluctantly decided that as her and her older husband were really not able to support somebody with Down syndrome, they should have a termination. And I look back at what I'd said on the radio and the TV and in meetings. I thought, might it be ever that something I said about selective termination could have been felt by that woman as a judgment of her? And I thought, it's not my right or duty to tell her that she was wrong. I can't. Nor to tell John Byrne's patients that they're wrong. I can't. They're not wrong. Perhaps that comes partly out of a sociological training I've had, but also as a human being, as an ethicist, I felt these are very, very private decisions, and it's not for me to say that you shouldn't do them, that they're morally wrong. The third thing that happened at that time was I spent a lot more time with philosophers. So bioethicists like John Harris and Jonathan Glover and others, reading their work, also arguing with them. And I realized that the positions that I was taking were not very academically robust. I couldn't stand them up. I wanted to have something that was consistent and logical, and yet I was coming up against things like the non-identity problem and other issues in bioethics, which really forced me to reconsider my thinking. And as a result, I moved. I moved away from that strong activist position towards a much more nuanced position, supporting women's right to choose, maybe anxious about the social context in which prenatal decisions were taken, but supportive of the variety of choices a woman might make, trying to change the system, but not making sort of strident activist critiques of it. And in fact, in 1999, I took a job at the Centre for Life, working for the university in what became PEALS, Policy, Ethics and Life Sciences Institute, at the University of Newcastle and Durham at that stage. And the Centre for Life was targeted by disabled people who painted swastikas on it and said this was Nazi eugenics happening over again in Newcastle. And I personally, from taking a job there, was roundly attacked by a lot of activists, attacked by a lot of disability rights folk. I was compared to Peter Singer, and I got a lot of hostile coverage and hate mail that I'd sold out, that I was taking a job with geneticists, that I'd been seduced by them, that I was doing it for money, that I wasn't intellectually or politically being honest or whatever. So that was very painful and hurtful to me at the time. It showed me that there was a cost of abandoning a very clear-cut activist position. That as you became more nuanced, as it were, you risked losing the people that were your constituency, and that felt a lonely place. At the end of that period, I probably felt closer to bioethicists like John Harris than I did to the activists that had denounced me so much. So I was not one thing or the other. That was a compromised position. The other area also where, as an activist or an academic, I found those two personas conflicting was around assisted dying. And I think I went through a similar process as I had done on prenatal diagnosis, that I thought about it, I read about it, I tried to do the logical, consistent, rational argument, and I thought, well, if disabled people were supporting choice and control over their lives in every other area, why wouldn't they be entitled to that when it came to the issue of death? And I also thought that if it was all about nothing about us without us and listening to what disabled people said, and the evidence said that actually 80% or more of disabled people supported assisted dying, then I had to reconsider my arguments and reconsider my positions. And it led me to the conclusion that a lot of disability activist groups are out of touch with the wider population of disabled people who have interest in this issue around assisted dying. And it led me to be an advocate for, in very limited sense, assisted dying, such as the Joffa Bill, so that for people who are terminally ill, I feel they should have the right to assisted dying if that's what they choose, and fully informed and not under pressure and all the rest of it. But again, that puts me definitely at odds with all of my activist friends. Disability activists are almost unanimous in opposing assisted dying. The organisations of disabled people are unanimous in opposing assisted dying. So to say that you're actually saying it should be okay leads you into having arguments with many people who you respect and care for, and that's a very difficult position to be in. Interestingly, the one person who came out and supported assisted dying for the activist community was the very person who'd written the most inflammatory and horrible denunciation of me back in 2000 for taking the job at the Centre for Life. So I'm not alone. I know that actually many disabled people agree with me, but you're still out on a limb. And it leads you as an academic, as an advocate, to consider how much do I want to be out there. Dignity in Dying asked me to be one of their patrons of their disability caucus, and I said no. I'm happy to lend my voice and to argue as an academic along these lines, but I don't want to be so closely identified with you, because it comes at a cost, and the cost is your comfortable place, or your place in the disability movement, which is threatened by that. So to conclude, I think there are real tensions. I think that Jonathan Haidt talks about moral psychology, and he talks about how people reach ethical decisions. And he says that most people, most lay people, are like barristers. A barrister knows the line they want to take, and they find the evidence to support their line. And then they argue in favour of their client. A judge, however, looks at the evidence and then makes up their mind as to what the right thing to do is. And Jonathan Haidt says most people in everyday life are like barristers. But I think when you're an academic, you have to be like a judge. You have to be willing to change your position. You have to look for the arguments and look for the evidence. And that's what I've tried to do. I've tried to be a judge. But that takes you away from the rigidity, takes you away from the certainty, takes you into grey areas, and it takes you into areas which are unpopular. I think that we have to understand lay positions, we have to listen to lay views. I think disabled people have a particular take on bioethics, which is very important. But I also think we have to hold them to account. I think lay people need to understand more about the ethical arguments and the requirements of things like consistency. I think that academics, bioethicists, have to learn and understand more about the everyday lives of disabled people, because it's those lives which inform those positions. And for example, you might think that disabled people have a poor quality of life, but the testimony, and indeed the empirical evidence is that disabled people have a very good quality of life. So you have to have that insight as an ethicist, not merely normative, but also empirical. And both parties have to meet, the ethicist and the disabled activist. And if we have that dialogue, I think we have a better chance of coming out with reasoned positions which take into account emotional and everyday realities. And that enables us, I think, to have the best possible policy and practice around ethical issues. Thank you for listening to my contribution.